Thanks, Andrew. Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen. What I'm going to discuss today is 5G in Ireland, and I'm going to look at from a number of points, commercial and operational. So, Betty and Andrew, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to present today. I know that today's webinar has been highly publicised on LinkedIn and social media, so I hope this proves as entertaining and as insightful as last night's other well-publicised TV interview and the fallout this morning. I'm going to, as I said, discuss 5G in two distinct arenas, commercial and regulatory. As a new technology, 5G enters the public consciousness and markets at an unprecedented time in terms of pandemic, but also a change in regulatory landscape. In my opinion, I do not believe that you can discuss the rollout of 5G without first acknowledging the legislative frameworks that underpin it in different member states. There are specific reasons to why 5G is experiencing such, some may say, unprecedented legislation and risk mitigations, all of which I'll touch on in this particular talk. Finally, I'll conclude my talk with a few comments on what operators in particular can do to prepare for 5G. So without further ado, the first area that I want to look at is commercials. This appears to me to be the main talking point of the 5G technology industry currently. So initially, what is 5G? 5G is the fifth generation telecom wireless technology, and so far the most advanced. This generation's height at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, or the Internet of Things, and I know Luis will touch on that in his presentation that follows mine. 5G builds on the gains that we witnessed with 3G and 4G. As 5G, the next generation mobile connectivity, rolls out in the coming years, it'll create value in many industries and for society as a whole. It'll be innovative in terms of use in new technologies, in terms of hospitals that will be equipped with 5G devices that potentially could enable remote patient monitoring, and smart ambulances that communicate with doctors in real time, digital wallets that connect phones, wearables, cars, and other devices to create seamless financial transactions, and 5G-enabled factories in which connections can be made among many senses more than ever before in terms of machine-to-machine connectivity and other IoT devices, again, something that Luis will touch on in his presentation. The three main highlights of 5G, I would suggest, are high bandwidth, low latency combined with network slicing to facilitate prioritized traffic or products. Then there's what we call the ultra-reliable and low latency comms, such as URLLC, and then MIMO, which is multiple input and multiple output, which is a method for multiplying the capacity of a radio link using multiple transmissions and receiving antennas to exploit multipath propagation. What that essentially means is it's easy to roll out 5G if you have the right equipment and to expand your network connectivity and your network presence, possibly than you could have done with 4G or 3G in the past. The main aims of 5G, as you can see on the screen here, would be increased bandwidth, increased speeds. The fact that nowadays you can download a movie in a matter of 4 or 5 seconds as opposed to maybe a couple of hours previously in the 1990s indicates that people's expectations, consumers and in business, has improved significantly since the 1990s. 5G potentially will be a different way of looking at technology in that 3G and 4G, you could argue, are consumer-led, whereas 2G and initial mobile phones were business-led. Potentially 5G will now be a more business-led area than 3G and 4G because of the way the new industrial revolution, or the fourth industrial revolution, will actually make things more prescient for many consumers and for business as such. If you take a look back at the different type of technologies, quick history lesson here, I won't get into too much detail, but you can see that the initial 1G technology came out around the 1980s as an analog system. In Ireland, that was based on the old 088 number scheme, which was the first Aircell number scheme back in, I think, 1988. This is followed quickly by the digital section in terms of 2G, which lasts from the late 1980s up to around 2003. And that included a number of different advancements in that period of time. For example, we had GSM, which is Global Systems for Mobile Communications, which enabled data transfer on top of voice communication speeds that were evolutionary in their time, around 30 to 35 kilobits per second. It played a critical role in the evolution of mobile technology, as around the same time, more and more consumers and SMEs were getting involved with the usage of mobile phones because they were portable, they were cost effective, and the speeds that they could offer in terms of data and voice clarity was higher at the time than fixed line networks. Following that came GPRS, which is basically based on general packet radio service. It helped 2G become 2.5G by allowing people to surf the internet using WAP as a means of actually browsing on an old mobile device. And then it was the forerunner for Edge, which is mostly what most people nowadays would use in terms of data connectivity when you use a mobile device, if you still are on a 2.5 or a 3G mobile phone. The biggest evolution possibly came with 3G, where we saw bigger advancements in network and data transmission. It had higher speed capabilities up to about 2 megabits per second, and it was widely used on CDMA 2000 and edge technologies. Following that, then we had 4G, which built on the old 3G network, but brought more speed in, and actually was based on IP protocol for data traffic and brought in different minimum data rates. It was also often referred to as the magic technology, as in M for mobile multimedia, A for anytime, anywhere, G for global mobility support, I for integrated world solutions, and C for customized personal service. So in terms of 4G, 4G LTE was introduced, which was long-term evolution, and it wasn't much technology as the path forward to achieve higher 4G speeds and a precursor for today's 5G. 4G in itself is a complete redesign and simplification of the 3G network architecture, which resulted in a significant reduction in transfer latency and so increased efficiency at speeds on the network. And that's really the reason we have 5G today. It's building on the gains of 4G in terms of technology and to try and reuse what people would have invested their original capex in terms of 4G. So in terms of an operator and even the society, what's the commercial benefits of having 5G in the network? A European Union report recently in the socioeconomic impact of 5G estimates that for every euro spent on 5G capacity, infrastructure networks, and so on, you can generate over €2.50 in multiplier effects up to around 2022. Now, as you see, that'll probably increase as we go from 2025 onwards as more networks are rolled out. It's also reasonable to assume that as these capabilities become more ubiquitous and accessible, the multiplier effect will increase, at least for a time, probably between 2025 and 2030. The availability of broadband has changed how we now work and relax. And we can see after many years of broadband rollout in terms of cable and also fixed line, that people have become very used to working at high speeds at home and in the office place. And particularly where we are now, we're working remotely, we're heavily dependent on high-speed broadband with high capacity and low contention to give us expected service. Even today, being on Zoom, we're not actually all breaking down because we have good contention coming through. Now, according to research conducted last year by ComReg Research, around 80% of respondents know about 5G, and the key points they know are speed and low latency. 57% of SMEs see 5G support remote working, and we expect that'll have gone up this year given the pandemic. And around 40% believe that 5G will increase productivity. Again, we believe some of these will actually have gone up by around 60% this year in terms of productivity. What is interesting to note, though, from a commercial perspective, is that 80% of SMEs believe that 5G is necessary for Ireland to remain competitive in global markets. That's not simply to retain position, but to actually be competitive in the market now, we do need to have 5G. While 67% of SMEs expect that new businesses will be developed through leveraging 5G in the next 2 to 3 years. It's heady stuff, and a great deal of positivity surrounds the latest generation telecommunications. My colleagues in Hong Kong recently wrote a paper about the opportunities within 5G, a number of which are here: healthcare, financial services, smart utilities, industrial manufacturing, consumer media. Take, for example, telemedicine. It's something that's seen a massive increase in Asia recently and across North America. We're forecasting that we'll have a net contribution to global GDP in the next 10 years only of $123.5 billion. We're looking at fewer hospital stays because people will be able to be more effectively challenged and checked and traced, by want of a better word, by the healthcare system in the next number of years. And again, we see a net savings globally of just under $90 billion with that. In terms of technology, we'll have the likes of drones, as we currently have in Singapore, delivering food and packages in conjunction with Airbus. And we reckon that'll be $155 billion in terms of commercial benefit to global GDP. That's not taking into consideration smart utilities that we would expect to have around $500 billion a year in terms of the impact to GDP, nor consumer media, where particularly real-time video games, AI, and VR will become more prominent over the next number of years, particularly with the likes of edge computing, where you could see potentially under $300 billion in GDP add-ons from those particular technologies. Industrial manufacturing is something that Louise will discuss in his presentation. But if you look at autonomous robots and vehicles, For example, these can be used laser-based perception and artificial intelligence to move through facilities without the need for fixed infrastructure, to use the 5G cloud to send controls back and forth to different robots on the factory floor. In addition to their safety and efficiency, they will also work with other technology, software and services as integrated inventory movement and robotic platforms, potentially reducing the need for labour costs, and can actually give $130 billion in terms of asset savings on an annual basis. In terms of financial services, we expect to see improvement in customer service and also reducing of fraud in terms of ATMs and bank cards over the next number of years, potentially saving the economy around $30 billion on an annual basis. It's probably worth noting that we'll become increasingly reliant on 5G and mobile technology, possibly to the exclusion of traditional fixed line services. If, like me, during the lockdown when work from home, we've experienced Zoom call failure, lagging internet speeds, and having to disable our VPN to send an email, you more likely will reach for your mobile phone and use that as a tether or a dongle to actually connect to the internet. If you're doing so, then you're foretelling the possibility of a future where 5G-enabled end-user devices will become a necessity, as phone lines were in the 1980s. There will be no restrictions on moving the device or dongle from home to home, room to room, office to office, or even to hotel whenever we get back to that. The use of 5G could be foreshadowing the cannibalization of traditional copper line services and digital cable television services. And that is an issue that operators and vendors need to consider in operational and commercial arenas as we go on the next, say, 5 to 6 years in particular. One thing to note, though, is smartphone sales have grown in Ireland in the last year by around 11%. 5G-enabled smartphones will grow at least by 150% in this year alone. We would expect by Christmas this year that most people who have like an Apple X device or an Apple 11 device will migrate to an Apple 12 device in order to get 12G-enabled mobile devices. We have seen an increase in ARPU in Asian markets, in particular, of around 80% for 5G users compared to 4G users. It's interesting to note, though, that OTT media services such as WhatsApp, Telegram, and iMessage represent more than 80% of all messaging traffic. That's having a detrimental effect on the current mobile operators' traffic for SMS and for data services. In fact, Juniper has forecasted that operator voice revenue will decline by 45% by 2024 in face of an increase of 88% in OTT mobile voice service use over the same period of time. We expect then that 5G is the tip of an iceberg that is expected to open up to new markets, new products, and use cases that we may not have even perceived to be realistic in a number of years ago. For example, in Ireland, the quarterly key data report from ComReg shows total mobile operator revenue has been stagnant since 2012, hovering at around €389 million per quarter. However, in that time, the expenditure for deploying 4G networks has increased substantially. As a consequence, mobile operators are seeing their profit margins continue to erode. The fact that people will be using more and more 5G, and 5G is more and more expensive to implement, potentially 60% more expensive depending on your 4G and 3G infrastructure, means it's imperative that operators have the right business model in place to take advantage of 5G for the national good and not necessarily looking at their own commercials. For the cost-conscious consumer in Ireland who is prepared to shop around, it should be noted that mobile data cost per gigabyte had dropped more or less 99.2% in the last 5 years. BT in the UK suggests €1 billion has been wiped off its market value in Ireland in the last 7 years, and it's predicted that the global telecoms market may lose up to €260 billion from traditional revenue lines in the next 10 years. These challenges will force operators to continue finding ways to reduce their costs while searching for a new opportunity to stay competitive in an ever-increasing marketplace. So I'm highlighting here there's a number of areas for operators to be aware of in terms of pricing. They have to be quite sensitive to pricing models so they don't have a high barrier for entry into the marketplace, that they have an increased use of IoT, that they have the correct plans in place to actually sell subscription packages that are cost effective for users as well. So the whole area of 5G is looking at not only the cost associated with implementation, but also the cost of selling the product across consumer and SME markets. As you can see here, slide from PwC in Hong Kong, we're seeing that there'll be a massive upward trend with the introduction of 5G over the next 5 years. North America, surprisingly enough, will see the biggest increase in GDP, around just under $484 billion, followed by Asia and then EMEA after that. We're seeing currently in Asia, the rollout of 5G in the likes of China and Hong Kong and Singapore has been driving the economies through the COVID period as well, to a point where we have seen an increase in ARPU across all countries at this point in time. that's something that should be replicated across Europe when 5G becomes a more stable and more well-known product set. Some of the main areas that 5G could be worked for example, we see 5G healthcare, as I mentioned before, smart utilities. So the total impact is around $1.3 trillion on an annual basis that we expect to see from 5G. Take into account that Ireland will probably be around 0.01% of the overall global trade. You're looking at around possibly $130 million a year extra GDP from GDP in Ireland alone. It's also worth noticing that there'll probably be more products coming to the marketplace that hitherto haven't existed previously. For example, autonomous vehicles will become a driver, no pun intended, for 5G. If you look at the city of Malaga, for example, they have a bus route working along the port that's driverless currently. That follows on from Shenzhen in China, where they have a bus route running around the city centre that's driverless technology. And also then, as I mentioned previously, in Singapore, they have drones working alongside Airbus with the Singapore government to drop food parcels to vulnerable people in the middle of COVID-19. And then they expect to be able to drop packages like up to the weight of 5 kilograms over the next number of years as well to reduce traffic on the roads and also to support a high density lifestyle. Now, in terms of how things are going to work for 5G, it's quite a busy slide, but what I want to point out in this one is there's a lot of regulations underpinning 5G because 5G is seen as such a key part of the global economy, and particularly the European economy, over the next number of years. So there's 4 pieces of legislation and supporting acts that have been brought out or will be brought out this year by the European community. To ensure transparency, providing and managing security, the EU has proposed a 5G Toolbox. This is a series of security components that member states can choose to implement as a way to manage telecom network security. In addition to the Toolbox, the proposed telecom security requirements, or TSRs, place an onus on telecom operators to ensure the networks are secure in terms of cybersecurity. There is due to be a consultation published in Q1 2021 in Ireland by the Department of Communications, and that will be managed by the NCSC. These requirements will be set by the government and backed up with enhanced enforcement powers for the regulatory authorities, in this case ComReg and the NCSC. And then to reinforce security across all sectors, the European Union is strengthening the NIS directive to a version 2 that will include more industry sectors who will be classified as providers of critical national infrastructure. If you look at the 5G Toolbox and combining this with security regulatory requirements, you're now looking to understand where security vulnerabilities are in the networks. So, for example, you need to understand the risks associated with the installation of equipment in a RAN, the core, or the edge network. The operators will now have a responsibility to reduce cybersecurity risks in their networks, and such undertakings require thorough knowledge of all assets within the networks. From an architectural perspective, an operator needs to ensure that any equipment he utilizes is safe from backdoors, hacking, it's secure in its code, and sufficiently robust to provide industry norms, uptime, for example. You then have the Cybersecurity Act, which I've mentioned here, which entered force in 2019, which creates a framework for European cybersecurity certification and for different schematics for products, process, and service. Once in place, these schemes enable producers to demonstrate that they've included specific security features in the early stages of product designs and users to allow people to know that a product is secure. And I'll touch on that particular aspect in a minute in terms of NESIS 2.0. The other main piece of legislation for 5G this year that operators will have to become aware of is the European Electronic Communications Code, EECC. This replaces and repeals the old frameworks, and it came into existence in 21st December 2020 in all the European member states, including Ireland. The EC provides that security measures should, at a minimum, take into account all relevant aspects of certain elements, such as handling security incidents, business continuity, monitoring, auditing, and testing of compliance with international standards. Now, there's nothing directly applicable to network equipment manufacturers or supply chain services and such, but operators are expected to have proper, robust check and challenges in place for third-party supply. The UK has been quite bullish in terms of how it runs the TSRs, and they've been quite detailed up to last quarter in how they actually want to run out their telecom security requirements. So in terms of diversification infrastructure of the market, establishing, continue to regulate detailed threat-driven security testing of operators and networks under what they would call Ofcom's TBES scheme. What I probably would say here is I would expect that Ireland will be something similar following the European Union as well. They'll want to ensure that there's sufficient robustness in terms of regulatory impact assessments and vulnerability assessments to give the government a realistic perspective that all telecom operators are doing their best to manage their network security. One thing you can say here is in terms of security, there is a kind of a triad here between national regulatory authorities, security vendors, operators, and the telecom vendors themselves to bring a level of trust into the marketplace for all products within 5G. What we're looking at here is to work with TSOs to provide the government with a framework to ensure that security is managed by the operator and is no longer regulator-led. Therefore, it does seem appropriate that a new dynamic is established by operators, vendors, and regulators work together to ensure that Ireland has a robust and secure telecoms infrastructure. This is a model that's been proposed by BSI in Germany. I think it has been adopted as an idea by the European Commission and has been pushed through GSMA and 3GPP at the moment. So what people are looking for is really the necessary version 2.0, which is the Network Equipment Security Assurance Schemata version 2. What this basically is, it's a baseline to show that your technology and equipment is safe and secure and meets specific requirements for network and cybersecurity. It can be used as a means to show the government and your customers, be they retail or commercial, that you have a secure network in place, that you don't have any backdoors, that you have appliance to ISO or NIST, and that you are actually taking security seriously. It's an industry-wide security measure. It's been adopted by the likes of Ericsson, Nokia, and Huawei as well. They've all signed up to actually have their equipment meet NESA 2.0, and each country should be looking at introducing NESA 2.0 as a means of showing the European Commission and the national regulatory authorities that they can actually show sufficient support and for security, cybersecurity within 5G. Given 5G is going to underpin a lot of the networks over the next number of years, the government obviously in Europe are kind of concerned that 5G could be in some way tampered with. So they need to have a level of reassurance that security of 5G is robust and can't be interfered with by any third parties unknowns to an operator, a user, or a government agency. And that's why NESA 2.0 is being probably championed at the moment by a number of the big operators and telecom vendors across Europe and the globe currently. In terms of the details of the EU 5G Toolbox, we have a number of strategic measures and technical measures. The box to the left shows where the European Union's countries, member states stood around Christmas time, and the box to the right shows the details required by a member state in order to ensure that the toolbox is actively implemented and is secure and robust to meet member states' needs. The basic premise of the toolbox would be to reinforce security in design, deployment, and operation of networks. It's to raising baseline security standards for the security of product and services. It's to minimize exposure to risk stemming from the risk profile of individual suppliers, which is a key point, and avoid or limiting major dependencies on any single supplier in 5G networks, because the European Union is promoting a diverse, competitive, and sustainable market for 5G across the entire 5G value supply chain over the next 4 to 5 years. And then we have here the EECC, which was implemented last year. As I said here, has 8 domains, 29 security objectives, and it's really replacing, repeating the old access frameworks, universal service frameworks, and so on that have been operating for about 10 to 15 years previously. There is a 5G supplement, which provides national authorities with a guide to ensure the security of the 5G networks and services is up to date and meets government requirements. And the publication offers an additional step to the guidelines for providing authorities with 70 proposed checks for 5G implementation. So in a way, it's to do with self-auditing. So as I conclude the presentation, I'm just kind of shouting now, what would the next steps if I'm an operator? What would I want to do now? There's 4 main areas. First of all, is to understand your current state in terms of what equipment you have, what equipment you want to bring in, and what your current security posture is. In terms of your target operating model, how do you work with a new technology regime, with a new technology that really yet to land as GPS? How do you react to legislation that is cropping up and at the same time run a business? I believe the key to all this is your roadmap and working in terms with you currently understand with legislation, understand your market, understand the cost of going to market, so understand your implementation roadmap as well, but also work alongside your national regulatory authorities to be as one with the triumvirate between your vendor, yourself, and the NRA. Because the other thing to bear in mind then is if you can get more people using your technology, you obviously get more return on investment. But if you have high barriers to entry, just as €1,000 mobile phones or €67 per month in terms of a digital subscription package, that may not encourage people to actually want to purchase a product because it just may be too expensive. So in terms of where to go, it's to understand what you want to achieve in the short term and then the longer term in terms of your technology, know your security, know where you stand in terms of roadmap to be more mature. If you want to roll out 5G quicker than possibly 4G was rolled out in Ireland, be aware of the different technologies that are out there. And if you can leverage your current networks for 4G, if they are mature, for example, or 3G, then your core, your RAN, you should be able to roll out 5G in a much quicker pace than possibly 4G was rolled out for previously. So I'm aware I'm coming onto my time now. So what I want to say is, this concludes my talk. Before I hand over to Lewis, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'd also like to thank Betty and Andrew for inviting me to speak today. And finally, I'd like to thank Edel O'Shea and Sujay Satish for helping me put this talk together. If people want to speak to me afterwards, they can ping me on LinkedIn. Thanks very much.
So with the new regulations, what will this mean in terms of managing security teams and talent? For example, following the German model, will this mean greater upskilling or larger team requirements?
Yeah, I think in terms of the upskilling or larger team requirements, I think one of the things I would always advise is, because of this year you have multiple different regulations, but they all come to make the same kind of achievement. The same aim is to have a more secure, robust 5G network. So in terms of upskilling, I think you're going to be upskilling your teams in terms of your regulatory, in terms of your lawyers, to understand what the actual requests and requirements are from the governments. But in terms of your own security team, it's basically continuing to what you've been doing previously. The certification, if you want to get more certified, absolutely, then you need more people to understand the certification process, be it ISO, NIST, or NESIS. But what you're actually currently doing, is as it is. I mean, go back to what Louise said there, in terms of know your use cases, make sure your team is updated with real use cases that are actually going to have an impact for you. I think that's the key to this, not necessarily upskilling or having a larger team.
Okay, brilliant. And I suppose following on from that point, that was obviously talking about the individuals involved. In terms of the vendors providing the equipment, what exactly do they need to do? Like, do they, I suppose, have they been keeping up to date? So the firewall vendors, the tools vendors, have they been keeping up to date on what they need to do for the rollout of 5G and security? I'll go to you, Neil, first in this one.
Yeah, that's fine. I suppose if you take a step back initially, not looking to say at those type of vendors, but looking at the overall vendors like Ericsson, Nokia, and Huawei, they all have a part to play in this, and in terms of everyone in industry has a part to play from top to bottom to OTT. So when you talk about security of 5G, it's different, I'd argue, to traditional telecom network security. You're not relying on a firewall from Palo Alto with software version XYZ. You're looking at everybody involved. So from the end user device all the way back down to the core has to be secure. And I think one of the questions I think Donald asked there was in terms of encryption as well. It's a different way of working. If you remember 4G LTE, you could easily intercept a 4G cellular device at the data handshake from cell to cell tower. In 5G, you shouldn't have that level of security breach. It's more efficient and more secure when you're actually doing it in the 5G perspective. So 5G has been built to be more secure than 4G and 3G have been previously, because you have more threats associated with 5G. So to answer your question, I think all operators and vendors have been aware of the risks associated with 5G, and I do think they've taken them into consideration.
Brilliant. So since it is difficult to prevent rogue admins from standing up to rogue base stations, what administrative controls are being put in place to detect and respond to these events?
I completely agree with what Louis said there. I think if you look at the 5G and the 4G networks, 5G more kind of technology risk is pushed to the edge of the network as opposed to the core of the network. So from the edge perspective, you need to be aware of who's connected and what's being connected. So if you do have likes of network slicing or MIMO in operation, that you have sufficient controls and alerts. You should know what's expected, is what I would say. So going back to, if there's a handshake occurring, you should know what the handshake from both parties looks like. And if anything unexpected happens, then you should drop the handshake or drop the connection. I think in the old networks, like I said, 4G, 3G, you can easily intercept the handshakes, but no one had a clue what was going on at that time. And that gave rise to the rogue base stations. I think with 5G, it's meant to be more secure to prevent that, because more of the risk was pushed to the edge. So if something were to occur, you can drop it off quicker.
Okay, brilliant. And I think that question was from Donald. So thanks very much for that, Donald. We have a question now from Kieran Caulfield. So how do you see the role of AI to manage and parse what could be extraordinary volumes of cybersecurity traffic flowing from a 5G implementation? Currently, AI does not appear to be ready. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, hey Kieran, it's a good question. In terms of AI, I suppose if you look at AI, you look at, say, robotic process automation, RPA at the moment as well, in terms of cybersecurity going across 5G, the volumes of data at the moment for 5G aren't justifying AI at the moment. Just not that many people use a 5G, particularly in Ireland at the moment, in industrial usage. When it goes into a factory to an M2M or an IoT perspective, I would see then it could have an AI perspective. If you look at a factory, I think there's one in Switzerland there recently, we were looking at, they had a number of robots on the ground sending information up to their own internal cloud via 5G, but they had to have AI in place. So if a piece of equipment wasn't arriving at the production line as expected, rather than shutting the whole production line down, they had a bit of artificial intelligence kicking in there, that the bot will go through its list of questions and see, can it do something different, or does it send out an alert? So in terms of 5G and AI there, it was using for production. I think in terms of cybersecurity, in the future, given the volume of traffic that we would expect and the volume of data that's going to be sent, yes, I do think AI will be required. AI is going to be part of the kind of the media perspective anyway for 5G, for video games in particular, and then for conference like we're having here, the likes of VR and AI, I do foresee will be a huge probably play for 5G technology in the next 2 to 3 years anyway. So not specifics at the moment, but I do think AI will form a large part for cybersecurity, particularly with RPA in the next 2 to 3 years.